like to welcome you all to tonight's event, which is a conversation between Dinh and Phoebe James from Archangel.
Thank you to Melissa and all her team for having us both here. So Dinh's got some slides to show first. Do you want to start with that?
Well, first of all, thank you for being here. I know it's sunny out there, and I'm amazed people were in t-shirt while I'm freezing. so it's very nice to be here. Thank you to the Voy, and also thank you to Archangel for making this project possible, but also the support, promotion of it, showing it in a few places so far. So I'm going to show you, because I was in a group show here a couple of months ago with the farmers and the helicopters. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about that work because it was shown here. So we're going to go into that, and then I'll talk about another project that I've done for Documenta, and then we'll start talking also about the colony. Okay. So this is the piece that was shown here. When was that?
It was just in August of last year, so August in 2015.
Oh, okay. So
the co-curator of this exhibition, Ryan, who unfortunately can't be here, who has a particular interest in artists from Vietnam, created an exhibition called Spring Watching Pavilion, and Dinh's piece was in it.
So that work, that was also my first video work. I've been making a lot of work using photo, collage and straight photography, but never making film. A lot of the work was reference to how the Vietnam War was being portrayed whether in Hollywood or in the press, in terms of photojournalism. And so I was looking at a lot of Hollywood films, and then that sort of eventually led to the idea of making this film, The Farmers and Helicopter. And it started with these two guys. The tall one is a self-taught mechanic, and the shorter one is a farmer. But they both grew up during the Vietnam War, and they were quite enamored by the helicopter during the Vietnam War. And that led them wanting to build this. This is the first helicopter that they built, thinking of it for farming purposes and emergency evacuation to provide a cheap helicopter. But then it led them into all kind of sort of trouble with the government because the government were threatened by this thing that potentially could fly and they cannot control it. If it's up. So they confiscated, and then the whole country sort of rallied around these two guys, and eventually they gave it back. And I was kind of fascinated by them, so I went to their place. This is the workshop where the guy who made the helicopter, he also fixed farming equipment and inventing farming equipment as well. And to kind of meet them and sort of trying to understand why helicopter, because I think as many of you know, the Vietnam War is also called the helicopter war. It was the first helicopter war. And so we start talking, and again, them sort of talking about their childhood memory of the helicopter during the Vietnam War, and how that kind of influenced the way of what they want to do today. And so I asked him if they would be interested in collaborate with me on this work. Now, before that, the structure of the film is three channels, and what I wanted was to use Hollywood as well as documentary footages in the film, as well as them talking in a way over the years, the way Hollywood had been portraying Vietnam, as well as documentary films. The Vietnamese have always been kind of the silence part in the film. We either the shadow in the dark, or we are the farmers who didn't say anything in the film, or we are prostitutes on the street. And so what I decided to do was to take all these footages from Hollywood and sort of render them, what's the word that you can't understand what they're saying, by just reduce it to helicopter sound, using all the helicopter footages of it. And so that was the idea, to kind of provide a platform for these people to speak, the Vietnamese to speak, and sort of render the Western or the American representation of the war to this just this helicopter sound. And so that was the impetus to make this work, to provide this platform for them to talk about their story.
Khi sinh ra tôi không biết là tôi mê với ai từ bao giờ, nhưng mà tôi có thể ngồi tôi nhìn lại lại hạt tiếng họ tôi biết chắc.
Thì có một lần tôi cũng đi giường, rồi tôi cũng gặp nó quần mình ở đây, thì nói chung hồi nào giờ thì cũng không có biết cái việc mà cái quần máy bay ruộng nóc hay gì đó, tại chiếc máy bay nó đóng ở trên, chỉ có cái người lái trên mà có thể mình gì đó mình thấy. Thì từ cái chỗ đó là tôi thấy lạ nhiều, tôi dòm là nó quay ở trên đầu tôi vậy thôi. Tôi nói sao nó làm cái gì ngộ mình không biết. Rồi tới cuối cùng thì tôi thấy nó quần giống nó xé trong tóc mình vậy, dựng lên khăn bay lên á. Rồi tôi mới nói không lẽ là cái như vậy là ở cái vùng chiến á, là như vậy nó bắn người. Thành thử ra tôi dòm lên tôi cười sao nó đi luôn.
Ngày xưa hồi nhỏ các bạn khi tôi học tiểu học thì tôi đã thấy thằng Thanh nó lên xuống để tiếp tế và cải thương ở tại quê của tôi, nên tôi sinh ra ở Thượng Vĩnh Cầu. Hồi xưa hồi nhỏ trong cái lúc tôi hồi nhỏ đó là một cái cổ máy kỳ diệu, và tôi có một cái niềm đam mê, mà trong đam mê nó cũng là một định mệnh. Tức là không hiểu lý do tại sao khi máy bay lên xuống thì tôi có thể đứng xe hàng giờ, tôi nhìn đó là hàng giờ.
Thì nó dần hoài vậy, lúc đó chú thích cái kỳ này tao bấm mày thử coi mày còn dần hay không. Chú có sách khẩu AK, chú ở công sự. Cái đó dần nó phát tới, chú đưa lên chú bấm nguyên một băng, nhưng mà không trúng nó. Thì bắt đầu nó dọt lên, cái rồi ba thằng nó bay luôn, cái rồi coi từ đó đến về sau cả khoảng chừng tháng nó không tới được. Là vậy.
Thì cái thường là cái chiếc trực thăng á, là cái từ hồi xưa ta gọi là chiếc cá rô phi á. Thì khi nó gặp một cái người Việt Nam nào mà cặp giữa vùng quốc gia và vùng giải phóng thì nó sẽ rà xuống, thì nó sẽ cháy mình. Nếu mà khi mà mình không có giấy tờ hợp lệ thì tất nhiên là nó ra dấu, Mỹ nó ra dấu thì mình phải dở tay lên, thì nó khi đó là nó sẽ bắt mình đem về chi khu hiếu thiện ở Gò Vấp.
Bắt đầu 7 giờ sáng có chiến trực thăng. Đầu tiên là 2 chiếc tổng lực của bay ngang đi khỏi cái
Sorry, we don't have much time, so
Yes.
we can't show it all. So.
But I think that sort of gives you a sense of what Dinh was talking about, having the helicopter footage and then having these people telling their impressions of what helicopters meant to them. And I think there's something interesting in this film which is the same as in The Colony, where at the start there's these dragonflies in the natural setting. Similarly in The Colony there are the birds flying around, and then you have these machines, in this case the helicopter, but in that one the drones. I wonder if you say a bit about that.
Yeah, I think for me the drone play very similar to what's happening now in the Middle East in a way. You know, Vietnam was the first helicopter war, and what's happening now in the Middle East is pretty much the first drone war that we're fighting now. But also what's really interesting is that the drones start out it was acting as surveillance or spying. But then now we're arming them, and it's very similar to the way the helicopter was used in the beginning of the war, when it was started using in the Korean War. It was just to evacuate the wounded, and then when it arrived in Vietnam, that was to mobilize the troop, and then they start arming it. And today what we have is what we call Black Hawk, which is basically a killing machine. Yeah, so it changed all this, and so I think maybe that's why I'm kind of fascinated with what's using the drone in a way to kind of approach that work.
Yeah, because in this as well, that you have this guy here who's wanting to make his own helicopter, who he wants to use it for those like good purposes for rescuing or for farming, which is quite a strange use of a helicopter. You know, that's not a conventional method of farming. So I
mean, it's economic, it doesn't work out.
Yeah.
But there's this, I think it's a desire to take control of something that sort of plays such a kind of havoc in your life. And I think we discussed about it's a very old story. You know, in the old day, would capture the elephant, for example, because the elephant come into the village and destroy everything. And so eventually we capture it, train it to do our own work. And so I think the helicopter in this case is that same mindset of to take something that was not uncontrollable at the time, and then now trying to train it into something that we can control. And I think that's what his desire is. And so maybe, I don't know, in the future, people in the Middle East capture the drone and do something positive with it.
Because there's also, and he's talking about, you know, deploying this for some constructive means to make, you know, farming and growing something. And I think it's interesting that the object exists, but then the different sets of humans sort of applied. It can either be a destructive force or it can be a constructive force, and it just depends. There's also some really nice footage in this film where in the Vietnam War, when they were shipping people, evacuating people, there were too many helicopters, so they just have to like push them into the sea because they took up too much space and there wasn't enough room for the other ones to land. So then it becomes an object which no longer has any use, and it just gets...
Yeah.
And
yeah, that was one of the most amazing footages that I found. Actual footages, because the American brought 5,000 helicopters to Vietnam for the war. And these were, going to give them the technological advantage that was going to win the war for them. But in the end, it didn't work out that way. And so at the end of the war, all these helicopters were trying to escape the city as the communists were marching in to take over the cities. And so they tried to fly out into the aircraft carrier. I was waiting out there, but at some point there was no more room, and so they had to get rid of them. And for me, that was like the quintessential image of American failure or American misadventure in Vietnam. This technology that they were counting on to win, it didn't help. And there's another work that I did that's sort of based on that incident as well. But well, anyway, we're not showing that.
Yeah, so it just becomes this like you're saying about the having a sort of beast-like quality that then that they have to just died and they just push it away.
The work that it's called Sao China Sea Pushkin. A lot of people look at it and thought it was about. I mean, one of the first impression they have was that, well, maybe I'll describe the piece a little bit. Basically, I just animate using a computer to animate all these different kind of helicopters that the American brought to Vietnam, and sort of just have them flying and then crashing into the sea or fall out the sky, crashing into the sea. It's just a very kind of abstract work, but a lot of people look at it and they were thinking of insect. Something happened, some catastrophe happened, and this insect just dropping out of the sky into the ocean. And then the ocean just covered like nothing happened. And so it's quite interesting how people, again, make reference to insect, like when I use the dragonflies.
Yeah.
This work actually meant a lot to me. I have been collecting these drawings by artists who were part of the war, and they fought for the communist side. And they make these beautiful drawings of just what's surrounding them. But, and many of them were in the middle of the jungle. There's no paper, nothing, but somehow they're still trying to document what's happening and the life that's surrounding them. And they're absolutely beautiful. But at the same time, they have no violence in them whatsoever. And I was like, why is that? For me, I study art in the West, so I'm expecting Goya drawings of the war, and the German do quite some very violent images of the war as well. And here, this have nothing to do with what we're expecting of a war drawing, and it's more like a summer camp. And so I decided to make a film with these people and ask them. This is one of the few drawings that have direct, reference to the war. But anyway, so we decided to make this work, and I interview them and show their drawings together, and sort of get a glimpse into what they were thinking as artists, as a Vietnamese citizen, and the thing they choose to draw, the thing they choose to record. For me was really kind of interesting. So we asked them to if we could participate in the film. And so we make this film. It's again, it's 30 minutes film. So we're just going to show you about maybe 8 minutes of the last section of the film. So
hàng ngày mình có thể ghi chép được, dù nó là rất ít, nhưng mình vẫn cứ phải ghi chép. Nên mình quý của nó như là cái tập nhật ký, chứ bây giờ mình cho ai xem. Vì nó là nhật ký của mình, rồi có những cái chuyện mà xem nó kỳ lắm, đúng không? Ví dụ như là cái này đây, cái này xem kỳ đúng không? Nó là nhật ký mà. Sau một trận đánh mình ở một cái nơi mà không có nước, thế mà để là tìm được một cái nguồn nước thì người lính khoái quá. Thế nhưng mà cái này làm sao mà triển lãm được? Tôi nói đấy, không ai dám, đúng không? Nó là của mình, cho nên là nhiều năm mình cứ để đây trong ba lô, nhưng mà chính tỷ là cái người mà khơi lên đấy.
Nói chung thì đối với mình thì nó là những cái kỷ niệm, nhưng mà đôi khi so với lại cuộc sống, cái nhu cầu cuộc sống thì đôi khi thấy cũng tội là nó trở thành dần nó trở thành vô nghĩa, bởi vì người ta cứ bước qua cũng như là lịch sử rất nhiều thứ mà cái nãy giờ là mình nói là đối với mình, còn đối với cuộc sống thì nó vẫn cứ sang trang rồi nó cứ lờ đi. Nên là đấy, có nhiều khi là có khi muốn giữ, nhưng mà mình cứ càng ngày càng già đi, mình tranh nó càng ngày càng buộc ra, nhưng mình thấy nó cứ thẩm theo dần.
Cái giá trị ký họa không phải những cái nét vạch ở trên cái giấy, mà giá trị ký họa còn là ông tác giả, ông đã vẽ ra cái đấy, nhưng mà ông đã sống với xung quanh, ông vẽ cái đó là ông nhớ tất cả cái giai đoạn, cái thời buổi, cái thời sống ông vẽ ra không chịu, ông nhớ lại tất cả cái khung cảnh, tất cả cái môi trường lúc đó ông vẽ không chịu. Cho nên là cái nó là một cái chứng cứ, còn cái hồn tất cả nó là nằm ở trong tác giả.
Mình không thể nói chiến tranh nó là thế này, nó là thế khác, hay là chiến tranh, đã nói đến chiến tranh thì không có cái đẹp, mà đã nói đến chiến tranh thì làm sao có cái đẹp được. Thế nhưng mà chính câu hỏi của bạn này đẻ ra một cái là, nhưng mà người nghệ sĩ thì trong cái ác ấy vẫn nảy nở, vẫn nhìn thấy cái mầm thiện của nó, đúng không? Đấy chính là cái đó, chứ không phải là chiến tranh. Trong chiến tranh thì làm sao nó lại có được cái vui được. Chiến tranh là tàn phá, là mất mát, là chiến tranh, nhưng mà không thể có cái vui được. Thế nhưng mà cái việc của chúng ta làm cái là phải thấy cái ác ý, cái đau khổ ấy đang đầy một cái mầm thiện. Thì chính cái đó mới là cái việc của anh em mình phải làm. Đấy. Tại sao trong các tác phẩm người ta không muốn thấy có súng? Thế như thế có nghĩa là trong cái ác luôn luôn vẫn nuôi một cái mầm, là cái mong ước của người ta về một cái đẹp hơn, về một cái không mất mát hơn, không chết chóc. Nó phải có chứ, nếu không có thì không có ai đấu tranh cả. Đấy.
Có một người tình nguyện hơn là anh gì về sau bị mù được, Lý, anh đã chỉ học được có 1 năm, tình nguyện đi chiến đấu. Sau lúc đến một vào Sài Gòn, anh ta ngồi trên cái xe tăng, chả biết bị nó bắn thế nào, hỏng hai. bác Hồ Lê Duy để bảo đảm quân đội này thế rất là cảm động. Lúc mà chiến thắng xong thì ra ngoài này mắt thì ngủ mà lúc hiện trường là đêm rồi, thế anh ta cũng có đi đá nào đó dẫn anh ta đến treo tường vào mà mù treo tường vào đi tìm các thầy cái bây giờ này anh ta cũng rất may là được một cái bác sĩ nào đó ở bên mắt thì sao ông thay cho được một mắt mới lấy mắt của một cái người nào đó vừa mới chết xong rồi kéo mắt chân này nhìn rồi bây giờ thì anh ta phải đeo cái kính rất dày thì mới nhìn được nhưng mà không ai nhìn được vẽ được nát tương được thế là may thì anh ta ở một tàng mình quân đội đấy thì chả biết còn ở hay là mấy rồi thì không biết.
So that episode that you just saw at the end with this artist who was shot in the eyes and then is still making drawings, that recurs 3 times in the film, told by the different artists, but they each tell it slightly differently. That guy just said, "Oh, I think he works in the military museum," whereas the guy before says like, "Oh, I think he's dead." And so I wondered, if you could just say it, because that recurs 3 times, and why that is.
When I started making the film, I didn't know about him. There are a lot of artists that were part of the war, and because after he was blind, he was not able to make that much work anymore, so his work was not known that well. So we were filming everybody, and then everybody kept telling about his story. So I thought it was really kind of fascinating. This artist become this kind of myth, kind of floating around his story, so I decided not to meet him at that time because I kind of like the idea of working with him, this myth, rather than somebody's real.
Yeah, he is really alive. Turns out.
Yeah, he is alive. And after we edited film and showed the film, then I tracked him down, and we went and met him, and it was pretty amazing. He still he do a lot of sculpting now because it's easier with the hand. He can feel it, he come and he greet you, and then he asks if he can touch your face, because that's how he can kind of tell who you are. And that was kind of really amazing to meet the guy. And he was able to drag under his bed this stack of drawings that was done before 1975. Before 1973, he was shot in 1975, about 6 months before the war ended. And the drawings are amazing. And he's actually was a 3rd-year student, not a 1st-year student of the art school. Yeah, somebody told him that the film because one of the people we interviewed say he's a 1st-year student, and he's a little bit upset with that. But the drawings are really beautiful, and so we able to acquire some of the drawings as well.
So they're all, they have their own kind of take on his history of what that might be, and I think that's really interesting. That they each have their own take on what the war is and how they're going to depict that, each in their own sort of individual style. And I think that's something that kind of unites these 3 films as well, is that you're uncovering these different histories and giving people a voice who might not be the received history that we have.
I think the Vietnam War is quite complex. It depends on where you are. You have a very different view of the Vietnam War. For us, it's a civil war, I'm from the South. It's a civil war between the North and South, between different ideologies. The American, yes, they were there, and they shouldn't have been there in the first place, but they were there. And so does the Russian and the Chinese. Indirectly, they were there also. And so the Vietnam War was a civil war, was a proxy war for the Cold War between Russia, China, and America. And then, you know, a lot of people in the West actually see it as an American war against this small country. So I think and as somebody who lived in Vietnam, grew up there, and then also went to America and see a very different perspective. And then coming back to Vietnam, and then you have also the communist government now, their perspective also, which is, you know, a war against the imperialist American. And so I think as somebody, I need to dig all the different angle up in order for me to sort of understand it as well. And so all this kind of story that whether in Vietnam is not heard or outside of Vietnam, it's also part of kind of learning process for me to kind of really truly get the whole view of what took place. And I was a child when all this happened. So I think growing up, didn't know what happened and why we, you know, certainly we have to leave the country and end up in America. That was something that I think I need to find.
And this becomes, you know, your story, your way of, and they say that in the film, they say it was you, Dinh, that brought this out,
Yeah.
and that's, you know, sort of, that you're collecting these different stories that you've been told and sort of working out.
Yeah, this project was really interesting, is that because as an outsider who come back to Vietnam, my family left Vietnam, and I grew up in America for 15 years, and then I came back 20 years ago. The local Vietnamese hated this film because this is the narrative that the government have shoving down their throat all this time.
Yeah.
And then for me to kind of sort of coming in and sort of embrace it in a way, it was difficult for the young Vietnamese. But these people, in many ways, have been forgotten also in Vietnam. Their work have been forgotten, and so they sort of kind of live quiet life, and then they may be asked to do a part of an exhibition on Military Day, or the April 30th, which is the end of the Vietnam War Day. That's pretty much it. And so to really, somebody to come in and really ask them, so they've been taken for granted. Their narrative have been sort of taken. Everybody assumed they know their narrative already.
Yeah.
And
so these are the artists who are sort of pro the current communist.
Well, not exactly. Many of them are actually very disappointed with the current communist government, because many of them start out fighting against the French even before the American arrived, and that was the war that was very much united. It wasn't a communist. It wasn't a war that was backed by the communists, the international communist movement or anything. It was just there was a need to liberate ourselves after the French had been colonizing us for 100 years, and it was very similar to what's happening here in Derry in many ways. In the film, in the beginning, they were talking about how can we be treated like second-class citizens in our own country by the French, and so that was the impetus. That was why the whole country was united in this. We need to get rid of the French, and so that was their belief. And when the war ended, then the Northern were taken over by Ho Chi Minh, and now the communist influence coming in, particularly from China. And they start carrying out things like the land reform, which is very similar to the Cultural Revolution in China and the land reform and it was completely wreaked havoc in the community, the society in the North, and it scared the South to, it's like, they're like, what is this communism that we don't want? And that's when the country split. But many of the people will believe in the Ho Chi Minh originally in fighting against the French. They still see the next war, which the American, is the same thing. So they don't see, and it's mostly the people in the South that see this is not what we want. And that's where the country split. And so many of these artists never changed their mindset into thinking the war against the French is different, or the war against the American is different.
It's interesting because they speak about just their duty and their responsibility to keep recording, and that like the bad things could happen or good things could happen, but their role is to keep documenting and keep recording that. And they talk a lot about how those drawings will live longer than they will, and that will be their record. And I think it's interesting now that you've made another record of what they're doing.
They believe that collectively, all of them coming together, all their work coming together, it will create this grand narrative of the war, the so-called the masterpiece of the war. So it wasn't kind of individually. But one thing that's really interesting, I asked them about is that why there's no violence in this drawing. There's no, and they said that they've seen so much of it that they don't want to see it anymore. And so they start to make work that drawing, recording of the friends and what's surrounding them, particularly during the downtime, because for them there could be months between one battle and another. And so they sort of want just to in a way, through their drawing, there was a kind of desire for some normality. That was just wasn't about the war, just about living daily lives.
And it's like reclaiming that for themselves in the same way that the guy in the farmers and the helicopters is reclaiming the helicopter.
Yeah, that was a kind of an act of not giving in to
taking
all the
control of the
something.
narrative.
Yeah.